Let's start with HTML. All right. So as we know, as most of us know, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Okay. It's basically an annotation language that is used by browsers to understand how to display information on the web browser. Right. So any kind of .html file that you create, that gets automatically related to whatever your default browser is, right, in your system, right? Or you can open it with any of the browsers, and browsers generally understand what this file is and how they need to parse that file in order to display the information on the web browser itself, right? So it's not a programming language. Please remember this, as a lot of people think that HTML is a programming language, but it is not. And the reason behind it, for a language to be called a programming language, right, a completely programming language, there are certain set of features or properties that needs to be associated or that the language can implement, right? So starting off with the fact that a language should be able to hold variables, which HTML doesn't support. There is no concept of variables in HTML. A language should be able to implement control statements, or you may better know it as, let's say, branching statements or if-else switch-based statements. You don't have any of those capabilities here. There is no capabilities of performing loop actions, for loops, while loops, do-while loops, and stuff like that. No aspect of functional programming. There's no functions, there's no arrays and stuff like that. So as a result of that, due to the absence of these features, you don't call HTML as a programming language. You call it as a markup language, right, or an annotation language, where we use these what we call as tags, okay, or HTML elements that represents certain structuring aspects on the browser, right? And using that, we are able to convey our information to the browser that this is what we are trying to display on the web page. And these are some of the structuring aspects that are associated with it, right? So you can see here to your right, this snapshot that I have from my Visual Studio Code editor is a very basic kind of like a hello world HTML page, right? So typically, when you are creating an HTML file, right, it has three main components, okay? The first component is known as the document type, which is denoted by this syntax !doc type, and then it says HTML. So that gives the browser an idea that this document, which it's going to parse or render on the web browser, is basically an HTML document, right? And every tag element that you have in HTML, that is with respect to the HTML syntax, is enclosed in these less than and greater than brackets, okay? And whenever you close the syntax, it has this forward, I think it's called a forward slash, yeah, a forward slash, and then followed by the name of the tag itself, right? So we will talk more about this from the perspective of what we call as the document object model that helps to actually represent the structure of any web page on the browser, right? But for now, remember that any HTML syntax is going to start with these less than and greater than brackets, and then within that, you write your HTML tag, whatever tags that you're going to be using and that you're going to be learning. And then generally tags close with the same brackets, but at the beginning, you have a forward slash followed by the name of the tag. Of course, there is a variation to how you close these tags, and we will talk about that in a little bit, okay? So what is important and what the takeaway is of course what it stands for, what the annotation, like the acronym for HTML stands for. The fact that it is a markup language, or also known as annotation language, because it's used to annotate documents, and it's not a programming language, okay? And then the whole purpose of using HTML is to basically structure your page display. It has nothing to do with presentation. Remember, presentability, or how aesthetic your page looks, how good your page looks, right, is something that is responsible, it is something that CSS is responsible for. So HTML is not supposed to do anything with presentation, all right? So essentially, let's talk about the fact that when you start to learn HTML, you will be introduced, if this is your first time, if you have not ever worked with HTML, you'll be first introduced with some of the different syntaxes. So for example, how do you write a paragraph in HTML, right? How do you create a division in your web page structure, right? How do you insert an image file into your web page, right? How do you insert audio and video documents? These are the kind of things when you start off with HTML is that you're going to learn, right? You're going to learn all these different things. But once you become comfortable with the syntax of the foundations of HTML, of the basic stuff that you're going to do, how to create lists, how to create a table on your web page and stuff like that, then the direction that HTML5 takes, it's the current version that we are working with, kind of changes, right? And that gives the depth to HTML, okay? Because later on we will learn, it's a funny thing, like as far as the content is concerned, other than multimedia files, you can create everything that is text using just 2 or 3 tags, right? But that is not what HTML is all about, right? HTML is not about learning syntaxes, and it's not about learning these annotations and then just using them, right? HTML, when you're a good HTML developer, then the depth of your skill set is determined by how well you can use HTML from a semantic perspective, right? So remember, for any programming language, there are 2 things for the language, right? One is the syntax, and then the other one is the semantic, that is the meaning behind the syntax that you use, right? So HTML5 gets its depth from the semantic tags that is present with HTML5. All right. So how can you structure your web page by using meaningful tags? So for example, in order to understand this better, let's look at this small example, right? It's a very basic example. But if you look at this tag here, which says title, right? You understand that this has something to do with the title of the page, right? Similarly, you can understand that this is the body of your web page and this is the head of your web page, right? We will talk more about the head part of it. When you see a tag like this, meta, right? So it should pop in your head that this is about the metadata. So similarly, when you create the structure of your web page, there will be a lot of different content that will be present on your web page, right? So let's take, for example, if you create a web page which has to do with your own personal portfolio, right? You will have different content, right? You will have some content that has to do with, let's say, your education. You will have some content that has to do with, let's say, your work experience, the projects that you have done, and so on and so forth, right? So these are all different contents, but these contents also might have separate contexts, right? The background of these informations might not be the same. Your education and work is not the same. Maybe the main content of your web page is something else, right? And whatever other contents that you have, those are all just additional information. They're not the main content of your page, right? So there are different ways in rendering these contents using HTML, but the question that comes about whether you're a good HTML developer is how can you convey these contents meaningfully by using appropriate HTML tags, okay? So that when you look at the tag, you can understand just by looking at the tag, this is what the structure of the web page, or this is what the context of the content that you are representing on your web page means, right? So that is the importance, or that is the depth of HTML5 skill set, right? Is how good are you when it comes to using the semantics of HTML5, right? So we'll also cover, once we have learned about the semantics of HTML, the syntax of foundational HTML, what are the semantic tags that are present in HTML5, and how and when you should use these semantic tags to accurately render or structure the information on your web page. And can you think of why semantic matters in HTML? Why do you need to use appropriate tags to enclose the correct information, such that the content of the information is also reflected in the tags that you're using? Does that make sense, the question that I'm asking?
Could you ask it again?
Right. So do you understand what a semantic tag means? Semantic is basically the meaning behind the tag that you're using, right? So if you look at here that there's title, right? If you look at this tag, you understand that whatever this is present, like whatever content goes within these 2 tags, basically has to do something with the title of the page, right? So essentially, when you write the body of your web page, right? When you structure the content of the body of your web page, the body is basically where, as a developer, we are going to put all our content there. That's the customizable content, right? So we need to use the correct tag to enclose the information, and that tag needs to reflect the type of information that is being displayed on the page, or that is being structured on the page, right? So, but when you open a browser, right? So let's say if we go to this web page here, let's say we open Oakland.edu. So if a web page renders like this, there is some HTML aspects to it, right? But you don't necessarily see any of these tags that is there. So if we open the developers tool, right, and then we go to inspector, we can see that the HTML stuff is kind of showing up here, right? So you have all of these different tags that are being used. Necessarily, we are looking at CSS, and you can inspect these different contents and stuff like that, and to show you that you have a button and things like that. And these are the tags, right? But this isn't the debugging tool of your web browser. This is something that you will notice when you are essentially looking from a developer's perspective. But if you think from a client's perspective, if you open a web page, you're not going to see any of the HTML tags, right? So the question that you should ask yourself is, why does it matter to develop our web page using HTML, using proper tags that meaningfully reflect the information that is enclosed by it? Do you all follow? Is the line of discussion clear?
Yeah, it's clear.
Yeah. So, and the reason behind it is that even though we can visually see this page, you have to think about people who have challenges or visual impairments when it comes to interacting with a web page, right? So if I have trouble visualizing a particular page, right, I cannot look at all the beautiful stuff that you have created as a developer. What I have to make use of is known as an assistive reading device. So what it does, it's plugged on with this device, and then what essentially that assistive reading device is going to do is basically going to go over these different tags that you have encapsulated or basically you have implemented here, and then read it back to the user, right? So when you think about it from that perspective, essentially the reading device will tell me that a title is here and the text of the title is whatever content that you have put here. So this is the reason why semantics matter, because it increases or improves the accessibility of your web page. And that is a very important thing, right? You should not just develop something like, you should not develop a UI keeping only one set of audience in mind. You need to make it as wide as possible, and you need to reach out to a wider set of audiences, right? So that is the reason why once we learn the foundational syntax, it is important for us to focus on learning the semantics and to make sure that we are using the proper HTML tag to represent the proper information or structure the proper information on our web pages. Okay, so as far as the evolution of HTML goes, I'm not going to read this out one by one, but what I want to kind of tell you is basically a summary of what was and what it became, right? And basically highlight the key points of how we got from HTML1 to essentially HTML5. All right. So 1990 is when HTML was first developed. All right. And initially, it was just used as a tool to kind of share documents between researchers, right? PDF documents. So all there was like attachment to PDF files, which was basically research publications, and people were sharing that, right? But around the 1993 time, the first web browser was developed, which was Mosaic, right? And Mosaic introduced the idea of embedding images, making things look a little bit more fun rather than having this bland interface that just shares, research publications, stuff like that, and there was no presentability to it and stuff like that, right? So it included a lot of graphics, not a lot, but basically the introduction of graphics came into being due to the web browser. Images started becoming a part of it, and things like that, right? So when developers realized that using this browser and HTML, you can do all of these different graphical stuff, make it look more appealing. All the different web browsers that started to originate from 1993 onwards, right? Explorer came to being around 94, 95-ish and stuff like that. And other browsers came into the picture like Netscape and things like that. They were all introducing their own support or features for the HTML language that allows them to incorporate a lot of variety of features with respect to presentability, right? If you know that there's a thing called marking, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but basically the text keeps on going on and on infinitely. If you have seen, adverts on Times Square and stuff like that. So that was one of the features that was introduced. And then there was a blink HTML tag that was developed by some browser, which would, blink your text and stuff like that. So everybody started doing their own, thing to make their browser more appealing, because that will kind of capture more audiences. If you're doing a good job with your presentability, then that will bring in more customers, right? And your user base will increase. But this led to the fact that if different browsers were introducing their own HTML tags and stuff like that, it of course resulted into cross-browser compatibility issues, which means that if you develop, let's say, a particular web application for one browser using all their HTML tags, then that browser will essentially not run to its ultimate capacity if that is opened by a client in a different browsers, right? So that was a problematic issue, right? And all of these problems that was coming in HTML was from the fact that people were kind of embedding presentation with HTML. So in order to get rid of that, browser issues, compatibility issues, and stuff like that, around the 2000 time, people decided that, the content needs to be separated from styling. And basically that is the origination of modern day HTML and then CSS coming into the picture and stuff like that, right? And then there were organizations which was implemented. So for example, the World Wide Web Consortium, and then with respect to accessibility standards, you have the Web Accessibility Initiative, and then you have the Internet Engineering Task Force. So as these organizations came into being, they acted like a group in order to make sure that there is some level of standardization with respect to web development, right? And that happened around the 2000 to 2005 mark, the 2005 to 2008 mark, and HTML and CSS slowly started to evolve and become more and more mutually exclusive from each other. Content got separated from styling, and some level of standardization was included, right? And that is how we got from HTML1 to basically HTML5, right? The most recent change of removing or making things more standardized was the removal of Flash plugin around, I don't know, the 2015 mark, if I'm not wrong, give or take. I could be wrong. I don't know the exact date from the top of my head. But if you all remember, back in the days, when you wanted to play some kind of, let's say, YouTube video or stuff like that and other videos, you needed a Flash plugin, right? So that was basically a third-party browser plugin that needed to be present in order to run multimedia videos. That is no longer the case. Now HTML in itself has tags that supports multimedia, right? In the form of either audio or in the form of video itself, right? So that's where the direction was, and that's where we stand right now when it comes to HTML5. And then CSS also evolved, adding more and more features and making things more developer friendly. And the current version that we are working with is essentially CSS3. Okay, so you can read this. There is some information here, just background knowledge, if you're interested to know it. And then going forward, this slide also has some interesting facts and stats. I'm not going to read them out with you. You can check it out at your own time if that interests you, as to which browsers are being used, and then what is the level of participations of these browsers with respect to the user base from different parts of the globe, right? So at the end of this slide, there is basically this website which kind of lists the updated stats. So the stat is kind of like a year old now, not a year, but like 6 months old. So you can check out the most recent stats and what is the support of different browsers like Firefox, Chrome. Explorer is gone, but Internet Edge is pretty good although it has a bad rep because it is coming from, it's sort of a, what do you call, a redesign of Internet Explorer, but that is not true. It has very good support with respect to debugging. It also supports HTML5 very well. And then Chrome is also good. Chrome is probably in terms of reputation, Chrome is probably the best. But the problem with Chrome essentially is the fact that Google Chrome is something that takes a lot of space, especially when the number of tabs that is low. It takes up a lot of RAM space. So the more tabs you open, the more it consumes, stuff like that. Firefox, in the sense that since it is free and open source, some people prefer it. I don't know what the general masses think about it as such. With the initial tab spaces, when you have like 2 or 3, it kind of scales well. But when you go to like 6+ tabs, the amount of RAM space that is used by Firefox almost competes well with Google Chrome. Like it's going to consume a lot, right? So remember, if you're working with limited RAM space, and you think your computer is slowing down and stuff like that, probably one of the culprits is either Chrome or Firefox, depending on what you're using, right? In that sense, Edge, not Explorer, but Edge doesn't consume that much of RAM space for the initial set of tabs, right? At least like 5 to 6, it can still do a good job in optimizing the RAM space usage when you use Edge, right? So just to keep that in mind. And I don't know much of Safari. Haven't had a chance to use it because I don't have that platform. Is it Safari or what's Mac's? It's Mac's browser, right? Safari. That's the default browser. Yeah. So yeah, I haven't had a chance to deal with this in particular, but you can check it out if you own a Mac to see how it goes. And Opera is almost extinct at this point of time, just as Internet Explorer. So not many people use that. There was a time when Opera was fun and stuff like that. But you can check that out, right? So that's basically the background. Stats you can check out. And this was, I don't know, this was probably with respect to the accessibility, like what is the support of the different browsers with respect to all the different HTML5 tags that are out there and stuff like that. So you can see that Edge is pretty good compared to the others. So this guy is almost gone. And Safari is also pretty good, yeah. But the thing is, like, when it comes to JavaScript and stuff like that, one of the best debugging tools that you have is in Mozilla, right? So that is another thing to keep an eye out for, is that if you're debugging, once you go past JavaScript into React and stuff like that, this person does a really good job in debugging and stuff like that. So these are some of the background knowledge that is out there, and you can check out some of them in your own time to get more familiar with what is going on in this domain and stuff. So let's now move on to actually the setup of our HTML file and stuff like that. And let's talk about working with our first HTML document. Okay, so essentially we will need an editor. As far as HTML is concerned, you can use any editor that you want, right? So you can use Notepad and stuff like that, and you can save it as a .html file. But that's not how we would want to do things, because as we progress, we will of course need a more versatile editor in order to make sure that we are able to keep a track of all our packages, install it without much headache and stuff like that. So the editor of choice is, of course, for me, is Microsoft Visual Studio Code. And most of you might have used this before when you have been working in other programming classes, or if you have been doing other projects and stuff like that. So to install it, just Google Microsoft Visual Studio Code download, and depending on the platform that you're on, Windows, you can just download the exe file. I think Mac has its own way of installing stuff like that. But you can also try Brewer if you want to install it through that. And Linux, you can use either the .tar files, or you can use the apt-get repository to see if Visual Studio Code has a version there and stuff like that, right? So once you install that, it's a pretty straightforward installation. I'm not going to tell you how to execute an exe file in particular, but this is what you're going to be seeing the first time. give or take, except for this window here, when you open up Microsoft Visual Studio Code, right? So if you need to get this is basically the terminal, okay? And I'm using the bash terminal, which is basically the Linux version of the terminal installed here. The reason why I have this is because I'm more familiar with the Linux side of the commands. If you're familiar using things like, command prompt for Windows, specifically talking with Windows, you will get the default bash prompts in Mac and in Linux, but this is only for Windows in particular, or you can use PowerShell if that is something that you are familiar with, right? The way I have split this terminal, or the way I even get this terminal, is if you look at the very top, you have the option for a new terminal, right? So when you open up new terminal, or you can simply type Control Shift and the tilde sign on your keyboard, or the tilde key on your keyboard, that should open up a terminal. And if you want to split this up, essentially you can go here and you can say a split terminal and choose the other terminal, and then you get these two terminals set up if that is something that you would like to do as well for your setup. Okay. On the left side here is where we have the Project Explorer. Any type of file that you add, any kind of workspace that you have will be visible here. Okay. And then all of your source file will be displayed here. You can split this up as well, just as I have split up the terminal, but that's up to your preferences as to what you want to do. Okay. So that's basically the structure. Okay. You can search for different files. If you install Git for version control, then you will get this menu. Right now, you may not see this menu showing anything. We will talk about Git and GitHub probably like after 2 or 3 classes when we start doing proper projects with HTML and stuff like that. That is something that is important. And I will show you, if you're not familiar with it, at least what the fundamentals are, how to keep a track of your versioning, and then how to upload your repositories to GitHub, and then get your source back from GitHub and work on any computer. So that will make you platform independent, so to speak, right? The other important thing here is basically this, sign here, which basically says manage. And the two important things, if you're working with Visual Studio Code for the first time, is basically your settings and then your extensions. All right. So if you go to settings, you will be able to kind of modify any of the text editor options to your liking and stuff like that. And then, dark mode and things like that. If you are wanting to change those things, you can get it from these kind of options here, right? You can choose the color theme and stuff like that. But what I want to talk about is basically the extensions first, all right? There are a few extensions that you would need to download for the time being. This is more than you will need, all right? I have it for different projects and stuff like that. So the first thing that I install whenever I set up a Visual Studio Code is a presentability theme called the material icon theme, right? So if you just search here in the Marketplace extension for material icon theme, it will show up, and then you just need to click install here, right? Since for me it's already installed, it's showing uninstall, but essentially you need to install this. What it helps with is essentially, let's say if you open up any kind of project folder here, right? It shows you these icons that represents the type of file or components that you're dealing with, right? And that is easier on the eyes to keep a track of what these different files are. You don't have to look at the extension. So you can see here, if it's a .js extension, you have a JS file icon and stuff like that. And these are all different icons with respect to React Native and stuff like that. But as you work with HTML, you will get, for example, this is an HTML folder. So you can see here, it has this HTML5 icon, which basically represents HTML5. So this is not functional. This is mostly with respect to presentability. It, yes, looks cool, but easy to manage when you're working with different types of files, different type of project stuff, and things like that. The other functional thing that I generally like to set up when working with HTML and CSS is basically this CSS IntelliSense for HTML that helps with the CSS support when you're working with HTML. Okay, HTML is kind of straightforward. It also has some snippets with respect to HTML, so you don't have to write a boilerplate or what we call as a hello world template and then edit from there. You can simply use the code snippets that is provided by this extension, and then you can work from there. So this provides it for HTML and a little bit for CSS as well. So please make sure that you install that. The next thing that I install is this one. It is basically ES7 plus React Redux React Native snippets. Of course, we won't need this right now, but in future we will need it. So please install this as well. Okay. And then the next thing that we need, this is optional for development purposes. It is there. So this live server extension allows you to create a server and then launch your HTML files using this server that is inbuilt to Visual Studio Code, right? Because without this, what happens is when we're just working with HTML, okay, when we're not working with any front-end frameworks like React, which comes with its own server, right? Anytime we change a file and stuff like that, or when we develop something, we have to go to the folder where our file is through Windows system or Mac or Linux, right? And then we have to open that in the browser, and then we have to refresh the browser manually anytime you make any changes, right? So the alternative to that is basically if you have installed live server, right? You can right click and then you can launch the HTML file with live server. And of course it will open on the browser, but Visual Studio Code is running a server, right? And if a server is running, you don't have to manually refresh. You don't have to go and manually open the file through the folder, to the file explorer and stuff like that, right? So it's kind of helpful when it comes to HTML, and it loses its purpose when you go to React and it comes inbuilt with its own server and stuff like that. And then the last thing that I like to install here, there's also one called lint, but this is the one that I personally prefer. It's known as Prettier. It's a formatter, right? So essentially, all the structure and the indentation of the code, you don't have to take care of that. This is something that will take care of it by itself when you install it, right? So install this Prettier code formatter. Once you install it, that's the first step. There are certain steps, additional steps that you have to take in order to make sure that that Prettier is up and running. So once you have installed Prettier, okay, you need to look for format. And then when you search format at the very top, there are two options that will come at the very beginning. Make sure that these are checkmarked. That is, the first one is format on paste. That is, when you paste a new piece of code, will Prettier start doing the formatting? And when you save your code, will Prettier do the formatting and correct all the indentations by itself, right? So make sure these are checkmarked. And then the next thing that you want to search for is basically formatter. So remember, first step, install Prettier. Second step, in the settings menu, search for format, and then check the boxes for format on paste and format on save, okay? And then the next thing is search for formatter. In the default formatter, go to the drop-down option, search for Prettier, and then select that, right? So if you follow these three steps, install, check format on save and format on paste, okay? And then check the default formatter or select the default formatter to be Prettier, then Prettier will take place, okay? Its effect will take place, all right? So make sure that this is how you set up. So this helps with a lot with indentation. You don't have to worry about indentation. That is a very important thing when you're coding, when you're programming, right? So if you are relieved from that responsibility, that kind of takes your mind away from one of the most, it is one of the most important aspects when it comes to writing good and clean code, right? So these are some of the extensions that I have installed that makes my life easier. If you know of something else, you can share it. And more or less, this is what you need to get things up and running. Okay, so coming back to the Project Explorer, if you want to add any kind of folder, what you can do is essentially you can create a folder somewhere, and then you can drag drop it here, right? So let's say if I create a folder like this to HTML, it will generally ask you, do you want to add folder to the workspace? It might also ask you things like, do you trust this author who is adding the workspace? If you're working with it for the first time, just say yes, right? It's a straightforward prompt. And then from here, you can basically change the terminal. So I can list it. Remember, the reason why I am looking at a bash terminal on a Windows machine is because I have Git installed, okay? If you do not have Git installed, you won't get this terminal, all right? So for you guys specifically who are working with Windows, okay, please install Git. That will give you the option to add this Git bash. This is what I'm using right now. And on Git bash, you can use Unix-based command, okay, or Linux commands essentially. If not, for now, work with either command prompt or PowerShell if you're familiar with it. If not, if you're not comfortable using the terminal, you should be, by the way, but if not, for this time being, you can avoid it, okay? You don't have to be stuck and frustrated based on that, all right? So essentially what I can do is I need to get something off there. So cd CSI and then 3150 HTML and just move here and then clean up this stuff, right? And from here onwards, I can start working, right? So if you're on the Linux bash, one of the commands in this should work for Mac as well, is something like this. So I can do touch index.html. And then if you look into the folder, the touch command essentially creates a new file, right? So if you open this here, index.html, and given that at this point of time, you have also installed the extension for HTML support and stuff like that, then you will, if you write HTML here, then it will give you the emet abbreviations. Essentially, this is what you can use to set up the boilerplate. You don't have to write the boilerplate from scratch, right? So remember, we always work with HTML5, not HTML. Not that it's going to make that big of a difference, but with the foresight of what we are going to do later on, and even looking into full stack development, it's better to just use the most recent version of the language that you're working with, right? So if I do HTML5, then this will create the boilerplate from us. And from here, let us start to understand the structure of a very basic HTML page. What is it composed of? What are the main components, right? So if I reduce or kind of minimize all of these tags, right, you can see that my entire document is showing just two things. The first thing is what type of document this is, which is represented by, of course, within these opening and closing brackets, and then this exclamation sign. Is the font size clear? Can everybody see the font size? Is the font size okay? Yeah, okay. All right, so you can just see there are two components here, right? So one is just the doc type HTML, which is kind of telling us what type of document this is. And then you have the HTML itself, the tag for HTML, which is basically the opening and closing tag. And by the way, if you want to write comments for HTML, the first thing you should know is how to write a comment. It's basically you have this opening brackets, which is how you start any tag in HTML, an exclamation mark, and then two hyphens. And then the closing is basically the same two hyphens and then the closing bracket or the greater than bracket. So essentially you can write this is a comment in HTML5, right? And whatever you write using a comment, it will not be displayed on the web page, right? That is kind of a no-brainer. So something that you want to keep in mind. So if we maximize a little bit on the HTML tag, and then minimize the components that are there, you can see that each HTML tag, which is the starting point of any HTML5, has two important pieces, right? Or two important documents. Two important tags. The first one is known as head, all right? And the second syntax is known as the body. Head, we can say that is something. So the head tag consists of all metadata information and external libraries and scripts. Okay, I won't say libraries as such, external CSS files, CSS and script files, right? So remember, in any kind of programming language, at the very beginning of let's say if you are familiar with Python, a lot of you said Python, a lot of you said Java, right? And some of you said JS, stuff like that. And there are some other languages. You import stuff, right? If you are working with C, C++, you include files, header files, stuff like that, right? So here also in HTML, of course, as we move forward, you will be linking style files, CSS files. You will be linking JavaScript files, right? If you're doing a basic web page. Using vanilla JavaScript and stuff like that, interactive. So that all that information goes into the head section of your HTML file. In addition to these external files, there is also information about what is the title of your page, right? What is the character encoding of your page that is coming? What kind of browser version are you using specifically, right? And then things like what is the size of the device that is accessing your web page, and what will be the scalability of your web page when a particular device size uses it, right? So, for example, if I access your web page through the desktop system versus a tablet or an iPad or a cell phone of different size, then how should my web page scale, right? And things like that. Should it scale according to the size of the screen, or should it always show a particular, set of height and width and things like that? These informations are metadata of your pages, right? It basically explains the background content or the shadow content of your web page itself. So anything that has to explain your web page, the structure of your web page, okay, that will go inside the head section of your HTML file, all right? And then whatever the body section has, right? So this is in the body tag, you put all your own content. So that means what content that you as a developer are trying to convey to your users, that goes into the body tag itself. So if I maximize the head tag now, you can see that there are some meta tags that essentially is going to represent the meta information. And these parts that you see in yellow are known as attributes of a tag. That is, attributes, basically you can think of it as like properties that further explain what that tag is conveying, right? So here I'm using a meta tag, but I'm specifying the attribute of character encoding. So it is using the universal format of UTF-8. I'm using a meta tag again, but here I'm using the HTTP equivalent of the cross-browser compatibility, right? And then the content is specifically designed for Internet Explorer Edge, right? So you can change here to Firefox, Chrome, and stuff like that. Here we talked about the viewport. Viewport is basically how your web page is going to scale compared to the type of screen and device that is accessing it, right? So this is basically the 1.0 tells that scale according to the width and height of the device that is accessing it, okay? And then you have a title, which basically is going to be represented at the top of the web browser, right? So if you look at this, here it says Oakland University. So this is basically what the title is. This is the title of your document. So if I change this to, let's say, my first HTML page, all right? So that becomes the title. And you can see that the moment I saved this, there was a little bit of movement with my comments, and it kind of aligned itself. The reason why it is doing so is because you can see here right at the bottom that the prettier documentation extension is doing its magic, right? So that's basically the fun of prettier, right? And here in the body, you can do whatever content you would like to insert. You can insert that, right, by using the proper HTML tags, right? So let's say if I want to put a heading, the heading tag for HTML is given as H1, okay? So this will say this is the heading of my page, right? Things like this. So if you do this, then this kind of completes the first hello world example of your very first HTML page. Now, the good part about it is, not the good part, but in order to view this on the web browser, I have two options right now. I can go to this folder that I just created, right? And then I can double click it and it will open it with my default browser. Or what I can do is I can right click anywhere on this file, all right? And then you can see here, since I have installed this live server, then I can just click on open with live server, right? And then depending on my default browser, so which is Mozilla, this will just open up. And you can see here on localhost on port 5500, okay? So that's basically the server where live server is running. I have my index.html file, which is basically the landing page. And there you can see your heading and stuff like that. So if you press F12 here, then you can basically check out all of the different things that has to do with your HTML file. So you have a debugger, you have an inspector, you can check out what is happening and stuff like that. The console that you see here is mostly for your JavaScript stuff and things like that. And once we go into CSS and stuff like that, we can also check out all the different features and aspects of CSS through this developer tool. I think F12 is the same for Internet Edge and Chrome as well, but you can double check that, okay? Or you can get it from this option here. You can go for the developers tool and find it from there as well, all right? So this is how you set up through the editor your first hello world HTML file, and then you can run it on your web browser using the live server extension. If you're having troubles with the live server extension, don't worry, just go to the folder, double click on the file and open it on the web browser, right? Don't get frustrated just because live server is not running, right? It's not impeding your functionality as such, right? So let's recap what is important when it comes to a basic structure of HTML file, and let's talk about a little bit on the syntax of what the syntax is all about. All right, so a basic HTML file is or a web page, when you're working with it, right, is represented by using the DOM. Okay, it's basically a tree-like data structure, and it stands for document, object, model. Right. So what it does is it is capable, this tree structure is capable of representing your entire web page as a tree structure. So what that means is at the very top, you have your document, right? So this entire web browser, what you see from here, this white portion that you see from right below this particular section of the browser, this is your document. Okay. And the very first node that you have in your document is basically the tag HTML. All right. Within the HTML tag, there are two child nodes that is the basic descendant of the HTML parent node. All right. So these child nodes are known as head and then body. Okay. So this structure that you see here, this tree-like structure that you see here, is basically what every HTML web page is going to have, regardless of what or how or what information it is going to represent or render up on the web browser. So this is a very important thing, and you need to remember this, okay? That how do you represent the first template or boiler template structure for any HTML page is basically at the very top, you have the node for document. And then remember here at the very beginning, we say that the doc type is HTML. So this is where the first parent node is coming from. The next parent node that you see, which is the immediate child of this particular node, is the HTML tag. All right, so that is what we have right after that. And then the HTML tag, if I open this up, has two child nodes, which is the head and the body. It is always going to be head and body. There is no kind of divergence from this whole idea. So that's why you can just remember this, right? And then within the head and body, you have other tags which becomes child node depending on where you specify it in the hierarchy, right? So for example, if we look at this particular file, right, I need to first write down all of these meta tags, okay? And then you have a title tag. So what I can do here is I know for a fact that there is a meta node, which is the child of the head node. And then there is a title node, which is a sibling of the meta node, right? So they are going to be on the same level. They're adjacent to each other, okay? And then you have the body node. And then in the body, right now, we have put a heading, okay? H1 is the largest heading. H1 goes from H1 to H6. And every time you go down the numbering level, the size of your heading kind of goes down and down. So let's just do that for the sake of doing it. So we can say heading 2, okay? And let's say we do H3 and then heading 3. Let's copy this real quick and paste this 1, 2, 3 more times. So this will become H4. This will become H4, H4, H5, 5, 5, and then 6. This is the last one that you have. Okay. So if you do this, save this, if you go back to our browser, then you can see that what these headings are going to do with respect to it being rendered on the browser itself, right? But anyways, what we were getting to is that the body, the node, has one child node. If you look at this document, well, now we have 6, but let's just focus on this. We have an H1, right? So what I'm going to write here is basically an H1. Okay, so when you write this in actual representation of the document, right, you have to write it with the proper standard. So here I need to write element is HTML. Okay, here the element is the head tag. So anytime you have a tag for HTML, you need to write it as element. Okay. Now, you know the fact that we talked about that these are all attributes. That is, you can think of attribute in a very, easy way to remember it is that if you need additional information to explain the HTML tag that you're using or provide supplemental information, then basically you use attributes. So the thing about attribute is attribute will always appear as a sibling to the node that you're working with. Okay, so I cannot represent this right here, but essentially if I give, let's say, a few spaces, then I can write attribute, and then I can say here, let's take the name attribute, and then this is how you're going to represent the attribute. So element and then attribute. And here, the content that you enclose within the HTML tags, the HTML elements, is basically text. If you have a text, then that is what you're going to be representing. So what you're going to do is similarly as a child to this, you're going to say text, and then the text, whatever the text is, which basically is this hello world information, then you're going to take that and you're going to paste that, right? And similarly, this attribute will also have a text, right? So the name will have a viewport. So what you're going to do is that to this child, you will have a text, and that text is going to be basically viewport. Okay, so this is how you kind of sketch out the structure of your web page. If the implementation of HTML for beginners, for those who are working with, is not clear, then the good practice is to first kind of sketch out what this document object model is going to look like. And this is going to be pretty important because later on when we move to JavaScript, which requires us to manipulate the DOM, and this is what the DOM is, on the fly, that will require us to dynamically, as the user is interacting with our UI, to add new elements on the fly, which you have not coded here, or delete existing elements temporarily, okay, or updating existing elements. So if you don't understand this tree structure, then the logic of being able to write those JavaScript code will become more difficult because you need some way to visualize what is happening from a developer's standpoint, right? Not a user standpoint, but a developer standpoint. And this is the tool that enables you to achieve that, right? So practice this. This is important. All right. So let's take a look at another simplistic example, which I probably have for the same hello world here. So if you draw it out and not write it out, essentially this is what you are going to be looking at. So you have the document, you have the root element, which is HTML, and then you have element head and body. Always these two are the child of HTML. So this structure here for this first two levels of the tree is going to be the same for any web page. What happens from there afterwards depends on you as the developer. You need to figure out what you want to do with your page from there onwards, right? So here you have an element which is title that has a text, my title. In our case, we have an element which is title and it has a text of, what do we have as the text? I forgot. My first HTML page, right? So this is basically our title. So we're going to just real quick put that out. Okay, we don't have any other child. So similarly, here we have a body attribute of whatever this page is, and then it has an element, which is an A. A is basically for anchor tag. Remember, any kind of hyperreference link that you want to put on your page is represented or done by using this tag and with an attribute of this tag known as href. Remember, we talked about it. Attribute provides supplemental information for the element that you're working with, the HTML element that you're working with. Href basically stands for hyperreference. So attributes are always going to be sibling in the tree structure to the element that it belongs to. That is the important piece of information that you need to remember. All right. Attributes are not a child of the element, they are sibling of the element. So that is the reason here I did not write this as a child of meta, because this is an attribute that belongs to this element meta. Okay, and remember, all of this will have element. I have not written it out for all of them, but please make sure that when you are working by yourself or you're going to present this to a client, then make sure that you write it with the proper standards. Okay. And then that element has a text called my link. So this link will be displayed, but when you click on this, it will go to wherever this href is pointing to. All right. And then this element is an h1 tag, which is the main header of your web page. And then the text that it has is my header. So basically, this is the text that is enclosed within the h1 tag. All right. So knowing how to take something like this and then translating it to a representation of the DOM like this is the first step for your exercise. Okay, this is something that you should start doing right now. Get familiar with it, and your life will be easier when you get to JavaScript. And vice versa, that if you're given a document object model, or if you look at a document object model, then you can take this and translate that to actual coding. So if you read between the lines, essentially, this is how you write algorithms for UI. That's the important thing that you have to remember. So that's why this is of emphasis, right? If you don't understand this, JavaScript will be difficult. If JavaScript is difficult, React is going to be difficult. If React is going to be difficult, well, that's the end of the line, right? So you have to again come back and revisit the things that you need to know in order to make your life easier when you go to React. So please practice this. This is basically where we start with your exercises from this point onwards. That what is the DOM? What are the basic structure of the DOM? What are the customizable structure of the DOM? How do you represent that? How do you take a DOM, translate that to code? How do you take a code and translate that to DOM? Okay, so that is the important thing. All right, so let's talk about some of the tags that we are going to be using. So there is a thing before we work on tags and get to know some of the important tags that helps us achieve certain things on this page is how do you represent the tags? Okay, so the way I like to call it, all right, so I don't know if the community also uses the same naming standards, but I see HTML having 3 different types of tags. You know, if you want to categorize it in some. So I call them as a normal tag. Okay, and then the second one, I call it as a self-closing tag. And then the last one category, I call it as empty tags. All right, so what is a normal tag? Well, a normal tag is something like this. So that means it begins with an opening and closing brackets. And within this, you can write your tag name. And then you have your content. And then you have the / within the opening and closing brackets. And then you have the same tag name. All right. So this is the representation of a regular tag in HTML. And a lot of the tags that you're going to see follows this syntax, right? So you have the brackets, the name. Within the brackets, you have the content, whatever you want to write, you know, the text. And then you have the brackets again, / and then tag. But then there are certain tags which falls into the category of self-closing tags. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't have any kind of content. Okay, all it has is basically the tag itself and then some attributes that provides supplementary information. So the tag there is typically going to look like this. That is, you will have, of course, the syntax, the name of the tag, but then you will have some sort of attribute which will provide additional information. Okay, so additional information, additional or supporting information, whatever you like to call it. But instead of closing this tag like this, it closes like this. So that means this / comes before you end this bracket itself. So that is the reason why it is called self-closing, because it doesn't have a closing pair. Every regular HTML tag has an opening pair and a closing pair. Oh, sorry, a pair is 2. Opening and closing, right? But the self-closing tag just opens, has some attribute, and then it just closes. Okay, so a typical example of a self-closing tag, or one of the most popular simplistic example, is known as the tag which is used to insert images to your HTML file. So that tag is known as img. Okay, that's the syntax of it. And what we do is basically we use this attribute that is src, which stands for source, that is where is the file that you're trying to embed on your page, and then within colon, no, not colon, apostrophes, you specify the path name of the file. If it is on your computer, if it is somewhere else on the web, then you provide the full HTTPS link of where that image is, right? In addition to this, you can provide additional attributes. We will talk about that when we get to embedding images, right? But then you just close this tag. It's because it doesn't have any content and stuff like that, you don't need. And then finally, the last category that I have seen in HTML tags is known as empty tags. So that means it neither has any content encapsulated or wrapped around in the opening and closing tags. It doesn't have any kind of attribute, right? It doesn't need any attribute to provide supplemental information. All there is basically a tag, right? So that tag, the syntax for that tag is simply going to be this tag name, and then it ends, right? The BR sometimes comes here. You can put this stuff. So essentially, let's say if you want to put a new line, right? You want to put a line break on your web page, right? So the tag for that, for example, is just BR, which stands for break. Let's say if you wanted to put a horizontal line in order to create separations between the two pages, right? Or between the different sections of your page, right? So the tag for that is also an empty tag, which is known as HR, which stands for horizontal rule, right? So let's say if we take this, okay, shouldn't have removed it. Okay, and let's say we put it right after here and we save this. So you need the closing tag as well that is coming from the documentation. So this is going to put this horizontal rule here, right? So the reason why we call it an empty tag is because it doesn't have any attribute, it doesn't have any content. Self-closing tags, it basically has a path name and stuff like this. So it allows us to, support whatever tags that we are putting into the picture. Okay, so let's look at some image here. Let me see if I have this, but I don't know how I get it from there. We'll do the image a little bit later. Hold on for a second. All right, so once this is set up, so this is kind of like the three different types of tag categories that you will find in HTML, right? So that's how you need to be a little bit familiar, because you need to know some of the tags that belongs to self-closing. There's also another popular tags that you will be using quite often when you get to interactive UI design, which is the input tag, right? So input tag could be in the form of text, it could be in the form of username, password, those kind of things, file upload and things like that. So that is also a self-closing tag. Button is basically a normal tag, but you can treat it differently, but that's fine. So what you have to remember here is the three different categories that you will see, and you should be able to recognize that, oh, this is a normal tag, this is a self-closing tag, this is an empty tag. That is what is important, right? So when you structure your pages, the first thing that you want to put in is, of course, the heading of the page that we just talked about. So remember, the heading goes from H1 to H6, right? And iteratively, the size becomes smaller and smaller. What is important here is for you to make sure that you don't skip any hierarchy if you're using one. So what I mean by that is, let's say you have H1, then you have H2, and then suddenly you go to H6 for no apparent reason. You just skipped H3, 4, 5, right? So don't do that. Again, this is a problem with accessibility. This has nothing to do with the visual aspect of your page. You can use it, nobody's stopping you, right? But you shouldn't do it when it comes to standards, right? Don't skip it. That doesn't reflect well with respect to development. Okay, so the next thing that you need to know is how to create divisions on your web pages, right? How to divide up your content and then wrap them in, let's say, what we call a container or a wrapper, right? So essentially, this next HTML tag that we are going to talk about is also known as a container. later on when we go to CSS, JavaScript, and stuff like that. Sometimes it is also called a wrapper. So the whole purpose, it has no meaning, right? H1 is for heading. That's the meaning, right? It is representing the heading. H1 is the main heading, H2 the next sublevel, so on and so forth. So there is a meaning. Title has a meaning, but this is a tag that has no semantic to it. It's all it does, it creates a container later on for when you use CSS so that you can choose these containers and apply the styling, or you can choose these wrappers and then apply the proper script logic that you want from JavaScript. That's the whole purpose of these containers, right? And this container is done by using the HTML tag called div, which stands for division. All right. So here you can write text as you want to within div, and that will be displayed here, right? So if we go back and check here, we can see that there is text, but div essentially should not necessarily be used to convey any kind of meaningful information, because that is not what its functionality is all about. Since it is a meaningless tag, then if you're using assistive reading devices, it will just keep on reading division text, right? And your readers, your users will not be able to understand the meaning behind the information which is being read to them. Why am I being read this information, right? Why is this information important? So that will not be clear, okay? So all I would suggest for you to use div for is to create containers or wrappers, whatever you want to call it, and then put all your main contents there. And as the content changes, the context of the content changes, then you would like to change. So let's try to understand this with the help of an exercise. All right. So let's say what I want to create is, what do we want to create? Let's say we want to create a portfolio website. Let me take away your favorite project option. Right? Let's say you want to create a portfolio website. Okay, everybody understands a portfolio website. So let's do a quick sketch of what the portfolio website will be all about, right? So for example, let's do it here. If we build a portfolio website, let's talk about the different HTML pages that it will have first. Okay, it's a website, so it will have everything. So we will have a home page. Sometimes it is also known as a landing page. Okay, let's say then you will have your CV page. Let's say you have your hobbies page, contact me page. What else? Is there anything else that you might have? If you want to do, you can also do a projects page, things like this, right? Stuff like this, right? So this is the design of our web page. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. There's nothing complicated going on. So what we are going to do here is in the home page, we are going to give a hello message, okay, and our image. All right, so who we are, where we study, things like this. Okay, it's a professional one, so I'm going to give that. In the CV, we are going to give education, work experience, and maybe skill set, what we are good with, right? What we are comfortable with, which programming language, those kind of stuff. Hobbies, I don't know, you can give the music we like, the TV series, TV or movie that we have recently watched, the book that we have recently read. So we are going to give an image of that, and then we are going to probably embed some images and stuff like that, some music, multimedia and stuff like that. Contact me typically should be a form, but since we don't have a functional backend right now, the forms is not going to be sent back. So we are just going to do an HTML form for now, a basic one, which is not going to be functional, but you can see what it looks like, essentially. And then projects, it's basically a list again. But what we can do here in order to, learn something out of it, we can give a table of projects done with start date and end date, something like this, right? So this is the whole project that we're trying to do, and through this we will learn all of the different stuff of HTML. Okay, so the first thing that I always suggest is set up your project folder. This is a sketch which is decided on it, right? And we know that these are the different pages that we are working with. So how many do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay,